I've never been one for superstition. God above, yes. The devil, certainly. But ghosts, monsters? The kind of nonsense they peddle in campfire stories and horror flicks. No, sir. That's not the kind of faith I hold. I'm a practical man. 53 years old. Born and raised in the South. With a backbone forged in hard labor and callous prayer. I've done roofing, plumbing, and my fair share of drywall patching. When the bishop's office called and offered me a live-in caretaker position at St. Vincent's, I said yes without blinking. A forgotten little clapboard church out in the pines, 30 miles from anything with a paved road. At the time, it sounded like a gift from heaven. A steady income, a roof over my head, and peace. Sweet, soul-stilling peace. St. Vincent's isn't listed on Google Maps. No one from the congregation has attended services there in over 20 years. Apparently, the diocese keeps it open for historical preservation. That's a polite way of saying they want someone watching it so it doesn't rot into the dirt or get used for meth cookouts by the locals. My job was simple. Mow the lawn, ring the bell at noon, make sure no vandals got in, lock up at night, keep the lights on in case someone passed by and felt the call of the Lord. The man who met me there wasn't a priest. He introduced himself as Brother Calvin, though from the look of his threadbare clothes and bent frame, I suspect he hadn't been part of any formal order for decades. His eyes were watery and yellowed, and he smelled like clove oil and mothballs. Still, he gripped my hand with surprising strength and offered no shortage of gratitude for taking up the stewardship. "The Lord favors the vigilant," he muttered as we walked the grounds, his cane tapping on the old porch. "But there's more to watching than just locking doors and mowing grass." I assumed he meant wildlife, maybe some drunk teenagers or worse, copper thieves. But when I looked down at the floorboards beneath my feet, old hand-cut pine, stained black with age, I thought I saw something shift between the gaps. A breeze, I told myself. Still, the feeling didn't pass when I entered the nave. The pews sat neatly arranged, covered in a thick veil of dust, as though awaiting a congregation that had simply never shown up. The crucifix above the altar had long since been darkened with mildew, and all the saints in the stained glass wore expressions that seemed subtly wrong. Too hollow-eyed, too mournful. "Don't stay too long in the vestry after dark," Brother Calvin said abruptly, halting at a warped door beside the pulpit. "And when you lock the front doors, use the brass key first, then iron. The brass one only keeps out people. The iron keeps out other things." I tried to laugh, to pass it off as a joke, but he wasn't smiling. That night, he gave me a small book, handwritten and bound in cracked leather. No title, just brittle pages and a smell like scorched wood. Inside were a handful of rules, cryptic and completely absurd. Caretaker's instructions. St. Vincent's Episcopal Church. Rule 1. Always lock the doors in the following order: brass, then iron. Rule 2. If you hear something pacing beneath the floor after midnight, do not answer it. Do not speak to it. Rule 3. If you hear a bell ringing between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., wait outside until dawn. Do not stay in the church under any circumstances. Rule 4. Once a week, leave a bowl of fresh milk at the base of the altar. Replace the bowl only after the milk disappears on its own. Rule 5. Never look directly into the choir loft after dusk. If you see something moving up there, read Psalm 91 aloud until it stops. Rule 6. If scratching comes from beneath the floor, ignore it. If it turns to whining, repeat Psalm 88 and light the frankincense. Rule 7. If you see burning paw prints, sprinkle holy water on them. I asked him flat out if this was some kind of hazing ritual. A joke passed down from caretaker to caretaker. But Brother Calvin only looked at me with those sunken eyes and said, "You'll see, Gregory, or rather, you'll hear, but I strongly recommend you follow them to the letter." And with that, he left, walked into the woods and didn't look back. I unpacked in the caretaker's quarters tucked behind the vestry. It was a bare room with a cot, a bookshelf full of outdated hymnals, and a wooden crucifix hung slightly askew. I spent an hour fixing it, though I didn't know why it felt important. Something about the tilt made my skin prickle. The church was quiet after dusk, but not dead. The old stones seemed to breathe. Every groan of timber and distant thump echoed too long. Around midnight, I heard a soft sound beneath the floor. 4 slow steps. However, I didn't pay much attention to this. I'd spent the next day cleaning out the old rectory. A whole nest of hornets had taken up in the rafters, and it took me the better part of 3 hours, a busted broom, and an unhealthy number of stings to chase them off. I was tired, sore, and muttering curses under my breath that I later apologized for in prayer. Sunset came early under that wall of pines. By the time I got back to the chapel, the sky was a bruised red, and the crickets had begun their incessant shrieking. I remember thinking that the air felt heavier than usual, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on my shoulders. Still, I went about my duties like always. Swept the front steps, double-checked the windows, turned off the old gas heaters in the back hall. When I reached the front doors, I realized I'd left the iron key inside. Not thinking, I locked the iron one first, then brass. "What's the difference?" I mumbled, more to myself than anyone else. The moment I turned away from the door, the temperature dropped. I don't mean a cool breeze or the chill that comes with nightfall. I mean seeing your breath fog in the air and feeling your spine go stiff, like someone just walked across your grave. I turned back, thinking maybe I'd left a window open somewhere. I noticed that there were no crickets. Not a single one. No rustling trees, no distant coyotes. Then came the scratching, soft at first, like a rat burrowing through insulation. It was coming from the walls, inside the church, not from beneath the floor, where I'd come to expect the odd, unsettling noise, but high above, near the rafters. Then it began circling the building. The sound moved with speed, always just outside my line of sight, scraping along the outer wall like claws raking old wood. I backed toward the pulpit instinctively. The hairs on my arms were standing straight up. I'd grown up around animals. Feral dogs, bobcats, even the odd panther sighting out in the marsh. But this didn't feel natural. It didn't feel alive. The lights flickered once, a brief stutter, but when they came back, I could see something through the stained glass windows. Shadows too large to be birds, passing between the trees, like smoke given muscle and purpose. I rushed to the front door, brass, then iron. I unlocked both and flung the doors wide. Outside, the crickets returned. The night resumed, like someone had pressed play on a paused cassette. The pressure lifted. The cold left me, but the wood of the door was burnt warm. A distinct paw print, as big as my outstretched hand, smoldered on the inside of the iron door. Not a scorch mark, not ash, just a faint glow, like the embers of a dying fire. It faded as I stared. I didn't sleep that night. I kept every lamp in the church burning, sat in the front pew with my Bible open to Psalm 91, reading aloud until my voice gave out. In the morning, I tried calling the bishop's office. No answer. I emailed, nothing. I drove out toward the nearest gas station, a good 30 minutes down the gravel road. The attendant told me the land St. Vincent sits on doesn't get good reception, and that nobody's been out that way in years. He offered me a bottle of water and said, if you're staying there long, I'd keep my boots by the bed and my faith close by. I followed the first rule every night since. Brass, then iron, without fail. But sometimes, even when I've done it right, I hear the latch rattle at midnight, as though something's testing it. On the fourth night, the silence in St. Vincent's became a presence all its own. By day, things remained tolerable. Dust motes spun lazily in shafts of light through the stained glass windows, and the bees from the azaleas hummed outside like a soft lullaby. I could almost fool myself into thinking I was just looking after a forgotten church, one of 100 scattered across the back roads of the South. The kind where the pews stay warm with memory, not presence. Where the hymnals are never cracked open, but still smell faintly of sweat and ink. But when the sun slipped behind the tree line, when the warm amber light drained from the windows and left them cold and colorless, the church changed. The first thing I noticed was the air. It grew thick, almost wet. I'd light candles just to push back the dark, and even then, The shadows clung too close to the walls. They didn't flicker the way shadows should. They just swayed, as if breathing. I swept the aisles that evening out of habit, dragging the old straw broom along the warped floorboards. Every so often it would snag on a loose nail or splinter, I assumed. But when I looked back, there was never anything there. Just clean wood, or what passed for clean in this place. The choir loft above remained empty, as far as I could tell, but I still found myself glancing up at it, again and again. Not because I saw anything, not because I heard anything, just because it felt like something was up there. When I knelt by the altar that night, I swore I felt a draft on the back of my head, a slow exhale that didn't belong to me. I turned, but saw nothing. The vestry was worse. The light bulb above the door had gone out, and no matter how many times I changed it, it always fizzled to black within minutes. I kept the door shut after that, except for brief moments when I needed the oil lamp stored inside. Something about the room felt wrong, like the walls pressed in too close, and the floor dipped in the middle, subtly but unnaturally, as though the whole room leaned toward something beneath. Once, I thought I heard the sound of pages turning in there, dry like old skin. I locked the vestry and haven't opened it since. On the fifth night, I stood out on the front steps for nearly an hour, staring into the trees, listening. Towering pines, gnarled oaks, and a few skeletal cypresses, standing like sentinels in the mist. And the quiet, the awful unnatural quiet that stretches between the trees, like thread pulled too tight. A couple of times I thought I saw something moving out there, just past the edge of the tree line, a low four-legged shape hulking, but whenever I focused, it vanished, always in the same place, just to the right of the graveyard gate where the rusted cross leans at an angle. Brother Calvin didn't mention a graveyard. I found it on my second day, hidden behind an overgrown hedge. Dozens of crooked stones, some so old the names have melted off. A few plastic flowers, no fresh graves. But someone had been walking through it recently. The grass bore trails, wide slow arcs, as though something large had been pacing. Tonight, I didn't bother sleeping in the little room they'd set aside for me. The cot in the back hall feels too exposed, too vulnerable. Instead, I sat in the last pew and kept the lantern close. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I closed my eyes, I'd wake up in a different place entirely. A darker one with no doors. Around 2 a.m., I heard something soft and rhythmic. Long, slow breaths under the floorboards, as if something massive was asleep below. I kept very still. At that moment, the church felt impossibly old. Not just in years, but in presence. As if it had stood before the roads, before the pines, before even the river had carved its path through the land. It felt like a mouth that had been shut for centuries was beginning to open again. I don't know what lies beneath St. Vincent's, but tonight I began to suspect it doesn't sleep for long. The next night came colder than the last. Not by temperature, at least not one measured on a thermostat. This cold felt more primal, like something in the church had shifted just slightly, and in doing so, changed the nature of the atmosphere. I'd started leaving the sanctuary lights off after dusk. The harsh fluorescence felt like an insult in that place, and truthfully, they didn't help much. They only cast sharp, jittering shadows that seemed to stretch in ways that didn't match the architecture. Instead, I carried the oil lamp from the vestry wherever I went. Its flame burned low and steady, and the light it cast was warm, even if it didn't reach far. I trusted it more. By midnight, I had settled into my usual place in the back pew. I didn't try to sleep this time. I don't know if I could have, even if I wanted to. I had taken to reading scripture aloud to pass the hours, quietly under my breath. Psalms mostly, Psalm 27, Psalm 130, Psalm 22. I was interrupted by the footsteps. They started beneath the pulpit and moved along the underside of the sanctuary in slow looping arcs. I stiffened. At first, I thought it might be my imagination, but the steps were too real. They scraped the underside of the floorboards as they moved, boards I had walked across 100 times now. I could hear the weight shift, the brief pauses at each corner of the nave. Whoever or whatever it was, it knew the shape of the place intimately. Rule 2 came to me at once. If you hear something pacing beneath the floor after midnight, do not answer it. Do not speak to it. I stayed perfectly still. My breath slowed. My fingers clenched around the oil lamp's handle so tightly, I felt the blood leave them. I watched the flame flicker twice, but it held. The pacing continued. It didn't wander randomly. It moved with purpose, circled the church twice, then passed directly beneath the pew where I sat. I heard the wood groan under the weight. For a moment, there was silence again, but not the kind that settles after a noise ends. This was listening silence. Whatever was under there was waiting for a response. Then it spoke, not with a voice, not at first. It tapped 3 beats, then a pause. I couldn't tell if it was a message or just some mindless rhythm, but it came again, this time unmistakably human. A man's voice, hoarse and low, muffled through the floorboards like breath caught in wood. Gregory. My body locked. It shouldn't have known my name. Gregory, it said again, closer this time, right beneath me. Give me a word. I gritted my teeth and shut my eyes. Rule 2 pulsed through my mind, over and over. Don't speak to it. Don't answer it. I've been down here so long, it whispered. So long in the dark. You don't have to let me out. Just talk to me. Say anything. Anything at all. The voice sounded wrong in its edges, as if it had heard language but never used it before now. It shaped the words like someone groping blindly in the dark. The boards beneath my feet creaked as it moved again. A new sound joined it, a shuddering breath, wet and hungry. I clenched the Bible in my lap until my knuckles burned. I will not speak. I will not speak. Gregory. It hissed again, and for a moment, I thought I heard my father's voice, not the real one, but close enough to twist something deep in my gut. Then came the worst sound yet. Laughter. Not loud or manic, just gurgling practiced chuckle. The scraping set my teeth on edge. Something beneath the floorboards walked again. It paused beneath each window, each pew, as if reluctant to leave, as if it were choosing its moment carefully. But eventually, the steps faded, and the sanctuary grew still again. I waited until sunrise before I dared move. Even then, I did so carefully, afraid that my footfall might somehow awaken it again. There was no trapdoor beneath the pulpit, no crawl space. Nothing but stone beneath the floor. However, something had walked there. Something tried to make me talk. I spent most of the following day in silence. Not praying, not even thinking, just existing. My hands folded together on the kitchen table, the Bible resting nearby, unopened. The words blurred now. The margins of reality and myth had begun to fray, and though I still clung to scripture, I did so the way a drowning man clings to anything that floats, desperately, without logic. I couldn't forget the voice, not because of what it said, but because of how badly it wanted me to respond. It hadn't screamed or begged. It was patient and calculating. By dusk, I stood once more in the sanctuary with the oil lamp, checking the corners. I moved slow, careful to light each candle in the usual rhythm. I recited Psalm 91 out loud, not because I saw movement in the choir loft, only because I felt a pressure high above the pews. When the clock chimed midnight, I heard a scratching, a gentle, almost rhythmic rasping beneath the floorboards, like a stray cat clawing behind drywall. There were no rodents in St. Vincent's, no pipes beneath the sanctuary, no air ducts, just stone and soil. Rule 6 surfaced in my thoughts, clear and cold. If scratching comes from beneath the floor, ignore it. If it turns to whining, repeat Psalm 88 and light the frankincense. The sound moved, slow and oddly consistent, like it knew I was listening and wanted to make the waiting unbearable. 20 minutes passed and scratching was replaced by whining, a terrifying guttural sound, thin as breath. It didn't sound like a dog. Not exactly. It didn't sound like a man either, but something between the two, stretched and warped. It rose from beneath the center aisle, directly beneath my feet, echoing ever so slightly through the wood. I stood slowly, psalter still in hand, and walked carefully to the altar, where I kept the incense box. The frankincense sat sealed in its little glass jar. I poured a spoonful into the brass censer, struck a match, and lit the charcoal disc beneath it. The resin began to melt slowly, releasing a rich pine-like smoke tinged with sweetness and rot. The whining intensified, as though it knew. I stepped back, held the psalter up to chest height, and began to recite Psalm 88 aloud. "O Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out day and night before you." The smoke from the censer grew denser, drifting up through the rafters like something sentient. The whining faltered, "For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol." The sound beneath the floor turned sharper, angrier. It became a thudding, as if claws or fists were slamming against stone and timber. The boards beneath the altar bowed inward ever so slightly. Not enough to break, but enough to groan. I kept reading. "You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep." The air in the sanctuary twisted. Not with wind, there was none, but with something else. A tension, like the walls were holding their breath. The whining shifted into something worse. A low gurgling yowl that sent a chill into the marrow of my bones. "Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you overwhelm me with all your waves." The pressure eased. The floor stilled. I let the censer burn out in the center of the aisle, its final wisps of smoke curling like fingers into the rafters. I didn't move again until the sun breached the eastern stained glass window and painted the floor in gold. And still, I didn't feel safe. There was no sign of damage beneath the boards. No burn marks, no footprints, nothing. But I knew it was testing me. Each night something new. A step closer, a louder hunger. And I was beginning to understand why the old caretaker never stayed longer than necessary. The day passed behind closed blinds and thick drapes, my thoughts tangled like roots beneath wet soil. I kept turning Psalm 88 over and over in my head, as if repetition might somehow dull the edges of the night before. The sound of that whining echoed behind every word of scripture I tried to mouth. The incense had worked. The rules, it seemed, were more than superstition. But that only deepened my unease. Because if the rules worked, that meant the thing beneath the floor was real. And if it was real, then I was living above something that should not exist at all. As twilight dimmed the corners of the parlor, I went about my duties. I walked the nave with the lantern at shoulder height, noting how the flame flickered when I passed the choir loft, though the air remained perfectly still. It was near midnight when I remembered about the milk. The bowl sat on the shelf in the small cabinet near the sacristy. Plain ceramic chipped at one edge. There was no dust on it, no cobwebs, as though someone had used it recently, or still did. The milk I'd purchased that week was unopened in the icebox. I poured it fresh, careful not to spill, and carried it with both hands down the center aisle, toward the altar. My footsteps were louder than I liked, each one echoing off the stone walls and arched ceiling, like a knock on some vast hollow shell. I stopped just before the step leading to the altar, knelt, and placed the bowl directly at its base. The rule hadn't said to wait, but I did. Not long, just enough for the silence to stretch unnaturally thin. I watched the white surface of the milk ripple once, as though something had exhaled near it. Then nothing. I stood and turned away, but not before noticing something new. There were marks on the altar stone, tiny round indentations in irregular clusters, like the impressions of small teeth pressed into soft wood. But this was granite, hard enough that my fingernails left no trace when I scraped across the surface. I didn't touch the marks. Instead, I returned to the back of the church and took my usual seat near the vestry door. The lamp beside me, the psalter open but unread. The rest of the night passed in a strange, suspended hush. The incense from the night before had long since faded, but I could still smell something sharp and sour near the chancel. The shadows along the nave seemed more dense than they ought to be, especially around the altar, where the candlelight faltered and dimmed unnaturally, as if refusing to linger near the bowl. 3 a.m. came and went without the bell. No footsteps beneath the floor, no voices calling my name, just the weight of the church itself, pressing in, grinding the hours down into something shapeless. When the first streaks of blue cracked across the stained glass windows, I dared approach the altar again. The bowl was still full, but the milk was no longer fresh. A pale film had formed across the surface, curling faintly at the edges, as if resisting something that had tried and failed to enter. Tiny bubbles clung to the rim, and worse, the indentations on the altar stone were deeper than they had been before, like something had come close but left hungry. I didn't touch the bowl, not until the sun had risen fully, and even then, I wrapped it in a cloth and carried it out to the old stone basin behind the rectory, where the rainwater gathered. I poured the milk out slowly, watching as the clotted surface broke apart and sank, leaving faint streaks like oil on the water. Next week, I would bring more. The rules had not said what would happen if the milk remained, and I would not be the one to find out. Throughout the day, for some inexplicable reason, I couldn't stop thinking about the choir loft. It loomed at the back of the nave above the main entrance, its carved balustrade like a row of silent teeth, grinning into the gloom. The choir loft had become something peripheral and sacred in its avoidance, like a locked reliquary. But avoidance is a discipline, not a guarantee. It was near 10 p.m. I was walking the aisles when I first noticed a sense of narrowing space. The vaulted ceiling, normally distant and unbothered, felt somehow lower, as though the roof had dipped closer to the earth. I told myself that long hours and little sleep had distorted my perception. But even the pews looked altered, angled slightly askew, as if the floor had bowed inward, curving like a spoon toward the altar. I didn't acknowledge the sensation aloud. That, I feared, would only affirm its presence. So I finished my rounds, returned to my chair near the vestry door, and set the psalter on my lap without opening it. However, I couldn't shake the feeling of change behind me, the kind of change that cannot be explained or rationalized, only sensed, like stepping into a room where someone has just been arguing, the air still swollen with things unsaid. My neck stiffened, my shoulders locked. I dared not shift even a fraction, because I knew exactly where that sensation had come from. Behind me, above the doors, the choir loft waited, and something inside it was moving. I could hear it, though the sound was as faint as the brush of cloth against stone. A kind of rustling motion, irregular and fragile, like dry leaves being disturbed by something that shouldn't have weight. My fingers, numb with dread, fumbled to open the psalter. Do not look, not directly, not even a glance. I could feel my eyes wanting to shift, some instinct to identify the shape of the thing watching me, to fix it in place by sight. But the rules were clear, and so, my gaze fixed firmly on the page, I began to read. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. The words came haltingly at first. My tongue felt thick, the cadence fractured. The thing above didn't move further, but I felt it listening, as if the words had drawn it forward, holding it taut in the margins of form. Surely he shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler, and from the noisome pestilence. A gentle creak from the choir loft. The weight of that unseen presence pushed down on my spine like a hand just above the skin, hovering but intent. Still, I did not lift my head. He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. Someone moved across the wooden platform above, crawling slowly with purpose, circling the loft as if pacing the perimeter of my fear. I kept reading. My voice grew stronger, steadier. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night. That was the line that seemed to do it. The pressure lifted abruptly, like air flooding back into a sealed chamber. The chill receded from my bones. The silence returned, but it was once again ordinary. Clean, passive, unburdened. I lowered the psalter to my lap, breath trembling like a wire stretched too tight. I didn't look up, not even then. It was only at dawn, with the sun casting gentle shards of gold through the nave's high windows, that I allowed myself to glance at the choir loft. Empty, of course, but something new rested on the railing. A long single strand of hair, pale, almost white, curled slightly at the end, and still moving, ever so gently, though there was no breeze. The beginning of the new week was surprisingly calm. But there was a certain night where the dark felt hollow, thin as eggshell, fragile to the point of tearing. As if beneath the weight of a single wrong breath, the air might rupture and bleed whatever lies just beyond the veil. The sky had been stormless, but wrong. The stars were too few. Even the trees, those old sentinels surrounding the church like cloaked mourners, seemed to bend subtly inward, their limbs curled in deference. My evening rituals had gone uninterrupted. Lights extinguished, floor swept, candles lit, the altar wiped with a square of linen soaked in water and salt. I checked the milk bowl even though it wasn't due again yet. I might have made it through the whole night untroubled, had I not heard the scent. It was acrid and charred, crawling in through the cracks in the stone, pushing under the door, seeping out from the seams of the wooden floor with unnatural deliberation. The smell of flesh roasted too close to bone, and beneath that, an animal musk, so thick it brought bile to the back of my tongue. I knew then what I was about to see. My hands had already gone for the vial on the shelf. The holy water shimmered in glass container, faintly blue in the candlelight. It was heavier than it should have been, not physically but symbolically, as if when I picked it up, the room somehow noticed. The first paw print appeared not 10 seconds later. It sizzled into existence just outside the altar rail. An ugly black crater, ringed by orange, as though the stone itself had blistered and split. The edges glowed from some internal heat, pulsing softly like breath. The shape was unmistakable. For toes, pads, and the sharp indent of claws. Large, much larger than a dog. There was no sound of footsteps, just the prints, appearing one after the other, pacing in a circle around the sanctuary, as if the creature were inspecting its old domain. I stepped forward, uncorked the vial, and let the first few drops fall onto the closest print. The reaction was immediate. With a faint hiss, the glowing edges receded. The print cooled, darkened, and then flaked away into black ash that scattered on the breeze of my breath. One by one, I followed them, methodical, hand steady, voice silent. Each time the water touched, the print died, but they kept coming. A new trail began to appear at the rear of the nave, near the heavy door that led down to the crypts, where no one had walked in over a decade. Then another set, intersecting the first. The footprints moved in unnatural rhythms, sometimes linear, sometimes circling back upon themselves, sometimes parallel, as though more than one beast moved unseen. By the 6th or 7th print, the temperature had dropped. Like all the warmth had been pulled out of me. My teeth chattered despite my clenched jaw. I worked faster, but then, near the chancel, I came to a set of prints that hadn't cooled. Even after the water touched them, they remained, glowing and pulsing. I poured more, no effect. The heat in them surged. The stone beneath cracked visibly, spiderwebbing out from the center of the paw. The scent of wet fur and scorched blood returned, stronger, and behind it something almost audible, a low breath literally from everywhere. The church was breathing, and the steps were no longer just impressions. From one of them, deepest near the altar, a single claw began to rise, just one curved black talon, pressing upward through the surface of the stone, as if the church itself were birthing it. The floor hissed and cracked beneath the intrusion. I reached for the last of the holy water and threw it. A shattering splash followed by a scream, not heard with ears but with bones. The claw sank, dragged forcefully back into the earth, and the print beneath it erupted in a cloud of sulfurous ash that hung in the air far too long. When it settled, the steps were gone. The one beneath the church had tried to rise, and it nearly succeeded. I thought that was it for tonight. Oh, how wrong I was in my assumptions. My illusions were completely shattered by the sound of bells. At first, I thought it might be a half-formed memory, stirred by fatigue and the lingering scent of holy smoke. But no hallucination rattles the coins in your pocket or stirs dust from the rafters. The sound came again. There was no urgency in it, just inevitability, like the toll of a funeral bell that had no name yet to mourn. The clock on the wall glowed softly, 3:14 a.m., I didn't hesitate. I threw on my coat, grabbed the small leather-bound Bible from the shelf, and walked out into the cold. I didn't dare lock the door behind me. The graveyard greeted me with its usual stillness. The frost had set in around midnight, turning the headstones into silver-flecked monoliths that stood like tired soldiers, watching over their fallen. The moon, low and heavy, bled its light across the crosses and statues, stretching their shadows into grotesque forms across the uneven ground. Minutes passed. The bell rang again. Farther now. The instinct to turn around and check the bell tower came and went quickly. I already knew it hadn't rung. I wandered the edges of the graveyard, not out of curiosity, but to keep warm. I counted stones I hadn't read before, noticed names I didn't recognize. Some markers were so old they'd cracked apart entirely, their inscriptions worn down to vague indentations like forgotten prayers. And that's when I found it. A slight incline behind the oldest crypt, where the moss grew thick and the ground never quite dried. I wouldn't have noticed anything if the frost hadn't been broken. Just there, in a narrow crescent, like someone had pushed through from below and left the soil steaming faintly. The grass was matted down unnaturally, crushed in a pattern that didn't match any human footstep. There was a slab nearby, half covered by ivy, a horizontal marker, unlike the others, flat and cold to the touch, in a way that made my fingertips ache even through wool. I crouched, brushed aside the vines, and found no name etched into it, just a single carved symbol, a bell. The stone around it had been disturbed, dirt lodged in the cracks. A faint depression suggested it had been moved before. I pressed my palm against the stone. A low groan answered me from below, like distant metal dragged across rock. The path down wasn't obvious at first, but it revealed itself with patience. A gap behind the crypt where roots pulled away from stone. A slope of flattened soil. Then, just beneath a half-buried archway, I saw what must have once been a staircase, carved directly into the earth. There were no handrails, no signs, just stone steps, descending into a darkness too thick to belong to night alone. The bell didn't toll again. At sunrise, the frost gave way to dew, and the graveyard exhaled mist through its crooked teeth. I waited until the light warmed the trees and the birds returned to their branches, before I dared to move the slab. Beneath it lay the mouth of the passage, a square hole braced in rotting wood and blackened iron, framed by bones of ancient roots, like fingers clutching a wound that never healed. I didn't pack much, just a lantern, the small vial of holy water, and the Bible, though the pages were beginning to wrinkle from my sleepless palms. I knew I wouldn't go far, not without knowing whether the path had an end. The first thing that struck me was the dryness. Despite the morning rain and the soaked soil above, the tunnel walls were parched, powdery, as though they hadn't tasted water in 100 years. The stone steps gave way to packed clay, and soon, I was surrounded by walls carved by deliberate hands. Faint markings clung to the walls in places, spirals, crosses, and some illegible scratches. As I walked, I began to see remnants of what had been buried. A rusted censer, a shredded choir robe, a child's wooden cross snapped clean through, each item placed like offerings. The tunnel opened into a chamber. The air shifted the moment I stepped inside, a smell like burned sugar and wet iron. The floor was stone again, smoothed unnaturally flat. At the center stood a crude pulpit, a single slab of black slate, veined with dark crimson mineral that pulsed under the lantern light. Behind the pulpit stretched a wooden wall of plaques, each bearing a name in trembling cursive. Some I recognized from the gravestones above. Others bore no surnames, only titles: the boy with the crooked smile, he who would not kneel, she who sang after sunset. And then I saw Calvin. His name was freshly etched, the wood unweathered. Above his plaque hung a tarnished bell. It matched the relief carved into the stone I had uncovered last night. Its clapper hung still, but I could hear its echo in my chest. I turned my attention back to the pulpit. A book rested on it, a heavy volume, wrapped in a binding of cracked hide. The pages were stiff, each written in the same meticulous hand. Records, dates, names, confessions. I turned to one near the middle and read. On the eve of the long silence, the beast stirred beneath the nave. We rang the bell to call it to stillness. It refused. We gave it Calvin. The ink was wet. I slammed the book shut. The scratching began beneath the altar. Circular, like claws tracing symbols on stone. I stepped back. The air pulsed. A low vibration pushed against my teeth. The plaques on the wall began to rattle. One of them fell. The tunnel seemed longer on the way out. Or maybe I had simply forgotten how far I'd gone. When I climbed back into the daylight, the clouds had gathered again. The graveyard was still, but I didn't feel alone. Something had watched me read that book, and I am sure it knew I had read it. By the time I returned to the church, the light had turned the color of old parchment. The brass and iron locks, still cold under my fingers, resisted more than usual. They didn't want to be turned, but I locked them anyway. I wasn't sure what difference it would make now. In the sacristy, I removed my boots. I don't know why. Perhaps some fading instinct of reverence or fear, as though leather soles might offend whatever lingered beneath the boards. My steps on the worn floor were almost silent. At that moment, I heard a shuddering inhale, as though it had drawn breath through mud and blood. It was rising from beneath the very floorboards on which I stood. The wood under my feet began to warm with energy, an ancient foul pressure that bled up through the grain. I stepped back. My lantern flickered. With a sound like splintering teeth, the floor beneath the altar burst open. First came the black smoke, thick and alive, coiling through the cracks. Next the paws, enormous skeletal things, wrapped in ribbons of shadow, each one seared with glowing symbols that pulsed like embers. And then its face. Where eyes might have been, there were hollow recesses, spilling smoke like a furnace gone cold. Its snout was stretched too long. White teeth floated in the smoke like bones in water. Entity flowed, every limb coiling and unwinding. The stones shuddered under its presence, and the crosses on the walls tilted forward, bowing toward it. I backed away, whispering scripture under my breath, though the words trembled, slipping from memory. The creature didn't charge. It watched. If such a word could apply to something eyeless. A demonic voice pierced my ears. "You still think this is his house," it said. "But you were the one who unlocked the door." My knees hit the floor. 1,000 images flooded my mind. Sacrifices made in secret crypts, bells rung in defiance, a child sobbing in a locked vestry while something clawed at the door. And Calvin, his face, his eyes, staring down from the choir loft, hollow and calm. The creature stepped closer. Each paw print it left behind on the stone burned, scorched into the floor with a hiss like boiling blood. I fumbled for the vial of holy water and whispered Psalm 91 with cracked lips, though the words spilled out wrong, twisted by memory, sleep deprivation, and doubt. "He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler." I uncorked the vial. The creature paused, its head tilted, a perverse parody of canine curiosity. With a cry that was equal parts desperation and fury, I cast the water onto the burning prints. The marks hissed and vanished, and for a moment, the thing recoiled, its shape losing coherence, smoke shivering apart into long trails that slithered backward toward the altar pit. But the creature didn't flee. On the contrary, it laughed. Not audibly, not like any laughter a human ear could welcome, but something buried in the tremor of the walls, in the sudden rattle of the hymnals strewn across the pews. Black fog began to envelop me in its thick embrace. I was plunged into pure absolute darkness. I think I lost consciousness. The only thing I remember is the unbearable heat, as if my hand had been engulfed by infernal fire. I came to my senses in the cemetery, lying on the damp ground near the very spot where I had found that cursed entrance to the tunnel. But now there was nothing there, no trace of an entrance. My right hand hurt terribly. Right in the middle of my palm, I saw a burnt image of a bell. It was exactly like the one I had seen in the chamber. The hound from the smoke marked me as its next victim. I spent almost the entire day writing down everything that had happened to me. I hear the sound of a bell calling me underground. I am publishing my story right away, while I still can. I want everyone to know the truth. I was killed by a creature from beneath St. Vincent's Church. Avoid this cursed place at all costs, and never accept a job here. Farewell.